Every year, Americans drink over 400 million cups of coffee a day, and almost none of it, not one bean, comes from the mainland United States. For over 2 centuries, that was simply a rule of nature. Coffee needs the tropics, warm nights, volcanic soil, altitude near the equator. America has exactly one place that fits that description, and it's 2,400 miles out in the Pacific, Hawaii. But right now, less than 2 hours from Los Angeles, there are coffee trees growing in the ground. Real trees, real cherries, real coffee, sold for more per ounce than gold-tier Hawaiian Kona. The question is simple. How is a tropical plant surviving in a place that isn't tropical at all? And why did almost nobody notice it happening? Coffee belongs to a narrow band of the planet called the Bean Belt, the region between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Inside that belt, Colombia, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Brazil, together responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's coffee. Outside it, coffee simply fails. Frost kills it in a single night. Dry air stunts the cherries before they ripen. Even a few degrees of latitude outside the belt has historically been enough to end the conversation entirely. Southern California sits 10 to 12 degrees north of that belt, hundreds of miles outside the zone coffee is supposed to tolerate. On paper, it shouldn't work at all. Every agronomy textbook for the last 100 years would have told you so. But in 2001, a retired county farm advisor who had spent years in Central America's coffee country noticed something strange. Ornamental coffee plants, grown purely for decoration, quietly surviving in gardens along the California coast. Nobody had planted them to be harvested. Nobody expected them to survive a real winter. They were simply there, tucked between hedges and patio plants, ignored by everyone who assumed coffee simply couldn't grow this far from the equator. If a decorative plant could survive there by accident, could a commercial one survive there on purpose? That question, asked almost casually to a small avocado grower willing to experiment, is the reason this entire industry exists today. Real tropical coffee regions rely on elevation to cool hot equatorial air down to the temperature range coffee needs to ripen slowly and develop flavor. California has no equator-adjacent heat to cool down in the first place. Instead, growers found something almost nobody had used this way before: the cold Pacific current running along the coast. That current pulls in a marine layer, a blanket of fog and mist that rolls in most mornings and holds coastal temperatures in a narrow, stable range year-round, rarely freezing, rarely scorching. It's the same fog that keeps Central Coast vineyards alive through California's dry summers. Farmers realized the fog could do for coffee what elevation does in Colombia: slow the ripening process down. And slow ripening is exactly what turns a bland, watery cherry into a complex, prized one. So the growers didn't fight the coastline's weather. They built the entire operation around it, treating the fog line itself as the boundary of where this crop could ever exist in America. Move a farm even a few miles inland, away from the marine influence, and the whole experiment falls apart. Here's the part almost no coffee drinker knows. California coffee isn't grown on coffee farms. It's grown inside avocado orchards. Coffee trees can't handle full, direct California sun the way they'd handle filtered tropical canopy shade. So growers interplant coffee directly beneath rows of existing, mature avocado trees, using the avocado canopy as an artificial rainforest ceiling. The coffee gets natural dappled shade instead of harsh open sun. The avocado grower, meanwhile, gets an entirely second crop from the exact same acre of land, using irrigation lines that were already installed for the avocados. For farmers, this solved a real economic problem. Avocado prices are volatile, and older avocado trees eventually produce less fruit per acre as they age. Coffee let growers pull a second harvest and a second income stream out of orchards that were already standing, without tearing anything out or converting the land. It's not a coffee farm hiding a secret crop. It's an avocado farm hiding a second identity underneath its own canopy. Today, this interplanted network has grown to more than 70 partner farms, stretching along the coast from north of Santa Barbara down through Ventura and into the hills near San Diego, all built this same way, quietly, almost invisibly, tucked inside crops everyone already assumed they understood. Coffee is not a fast crop anywhere in the world, and California made it slower. A newly planted tree takes 3 to 4 years before its first meaningful harvest. Add the extra stress of an unfamiliar climate, hundreds of miles outside the plant's comfort zone, and early growers spent nearly 2 decades simply figuring out which varieties could survive here at all, let alone produce cherries worth drinking. Dozens of varieties were tested, planted in small experimental blocks, and quietly abandoned when they failed to thrive. The ones that stuck: Caturra, Catue, Typica, Bourbon, Lorena, and eventually the ultra-prized Geisha, the same variety that sells for record-breaking prices at international coffee auctions from Panama to Ethiopia. And here's the twist nobody expected. Because California's dry, Mediterranean climate is naturally low in the humidity that spreads coffee leaf rust, one of the most devastating diseases in the entire global coffee industry. Some of these historically fragile, high-flavor varieties actually perform better here than they do back in their native tropics. Varieties that are considered too disease-prone to grow profitably in parts of Central America turn out to be nearly bulletproof on a foggy California hillside. The disadvantage of being outside the bean belt became, almost by accident, one of its biggest advantages, because this entire industry rests on so few farms and so few original mother trees. Growers had one obvious vulnerability. If disease ever entered the nursery stock, it could spread through every farm in the network in a single planting season. So the network built its safeguard early, partnering with plant science labs to supply certified, disease-screened plant material to every grower rather than letting farms propagate cuttings on their own. Every young tree entering this system is tracked back to a known, tested source. It's the same logic used in strawberry and blueberry nurseries. When every plant on every farm shares nearly identical genetics, one weak link can become an industry-wide collapse. Coffee's growers learned that lesson before it happened to them, not after. This obsession with traceability didn't stop at the nursery. Some farms in the network have gone as far as tagging individual harvest lots with blockchain-based tracking. So a bag of coffee sold in a specialty shop can be traced back to the exact farm block, the exact processing date, sometimes even the exact fermentation tank it came from. In an industry built on scarcity and story, knowing precisely where every bean came from isn't a gimmick. It's the entire business model. In Brazil or Vietnam, entire coffee crops can be stripped by machine in a single pass because the trees are bred and pruned to ripen together, all at once, across the whole field. California's small, hand-tended trees don't ripen that way. On a single branch, you'll find green, yellow, and deep red cherries all at once, sometimes within the same handful, sometimes on the very same day. That means every cherry has to be hand-picked individually, often requiring multiple passes through the same tree over several weeks as different cherries reach peak ripeness. It's slow, it's expensive, and it's the exact opposite of the industrial, robot-driven harvest lines seen across most of American agriculture, where speed and volume usually win. Some California coffee farms have made an even more deliberate choice, paying pickers by the hour instead of by the pound. Pay-by-weight harvesting, the standard in most large-scale American crops, rewards speed above everything else. But a crop like this rewards patience, since only the reddest, fully ripe cherries produce the flavor the entire system is built around. Pay a picker to move fast, and you get a mediocre cup. Pay them to be careful, and you get the $18 an ounce coffee this whole operation was designed to produce in the first place. Once picked, the cherry itself is still mostly fruit. The coffee bean is just the seed hiding inside, and getting from a red cherry to a roastable green bean requires an entire second production chain most coffee drinkers never think about. First, the cherry's outer skin and pulp are pulped away by machine. Then the beans, still coated in a sticky layer of mucilage, are fermented in tanks, sometimes for over 24 hours, breaking down the sugars clinging to the bean's surface and shaping the final flavor in the cup. After fermentation comes washing, and after washing comes drying, sometimes for weeks on raised beds, turned by hand every few hours until the moisture content hits the exact percentage roasters require. This process alone can take up to 4 months from the moment a cherry is picked to the moment a green bean is ready to ship. Compare that to a semi-trailer of Brazilian Robusta beans harvested by machine in bulk and processed within days on an industrial scale. California coffee moves at a completely different speed, closer to how a boutique winery handles a single vintage than how a commodity crop moves through a modern supply chain. Some farms in the network have gone as far as putting a former winemaker in charge of post-harvest processing, treating fermentation and drying with the same obsessive control a vintner applies to a barrel of Cabernet. Hawaii, America's only long-established coffee origin, produces several million pounds of coffee a year from an industry with roots stretching back to the 1820s. California's entire coffee network, by comparison, produces only a few thousand pounds annually, grown across roughly 100 acres total, spread thin across dozens of small farms instead of concentrated in large plantations. That scarcity, stacked on top of the years of research and development, the hand harvesting, and the months-long processing chain, pushes prices into territory almost no American crop ever reaches. Early lots from this network have sold for prices rivaling $18 an ounce, not a pound, an ounce, putting California coffee in the same pricing tier as the rarest microlot coffees on Earth, the kind that sell in single-digit pound batches to competitive baristas and collectors. This was never a crop trying to compete with a can of coffee on a grocery shelf. From the very beginning, it was positioned closer to a small batch, single vineyard wine label than a breakfast staple, sold in tiny, traceable lots with the individual farm's name printed directly on the bag. Sometimes even the name of the exact block the cherries were picked from. Because California coffee exists so far outside its natural range, it became an unusually attractive subject for serious plant science, the kind normally reserved for crops with far more acreage behind them. In 2017, researchers used genetic material pulled from one of these very California trees to help sequence the Arabica coffee genome for the first time in history, a milestone for the entire global coffee industry, achieved not in Ethiopia or Colombia, but in the fog-covered hills above Santa Barbara. That collaboration didn't end with a single genome map. Breeding programs tied to this network, working alongside university researchers, are now developing disease-resistant, climate-adapted coffee varieties, essentially trying to engineer a plant that can survive conditions it was never built to tolerate. Growers are also experimenting with precision irrigation systems and protective tunnel structures, technology borrowed from other high-value California crops to buffer the trees against the occasional hard frost or unusually dry stretch that would otherwise wipe out a season's harvest. If any of it works at scale, the techniques developed here could matter far beyond 100 acres in Southern California. As climate change pushes traditional coffee-growing regions toward hotter, less predictable conditions of their own, a body of research built on growing coffee somewhere it technically shouldn't survive becomes less of a novelty and more of a preview. Once word got around that a tropical crop could survive on the California coast, growers in other unlikely corners of the country started asking the same question about their own backyards. Small experimental plantings have popped up in the Gulf Coast regions of Texas and Florida, states with none of California's cooling marine fog, but with something else coffee needs: warmth, that rarely, if ever, dips to a hard freeze. The challenge in those regions runs in the opposite direction from California's. Instead of fighting cool, foggy air, growers there have to fight tropical storms, hurricane season, and summer heat that can scorch a coffee leaf just as easily as a winter frost can kill one. Nobody has come close to building a network the size of California's 100-acre footprint in either state. What exists so far are backyard trials, university test plots, and a handful of hobbyist farmers chasing the same instinct that started this whole story. What if the textbook is wrong about where this plant can live? None of it has proven commercially viable yet. But every one of those small, scattered attempts owes a debt to the same discovery that happened on the California coast. 2 decades earlier, the idea that a tropical crop's real limits might be narrower and stranger than anyone assumed. California isn't actually the second place coffee grows in the United States. It's the third, and the second one tells a very different story, a warning about exactly what this new industry could lose if it isn't careful. Puerto Rico has grown coffee since the 1730s, and by the late 1800s, it was one of the largest coffee producers on Earth, so prized that Puerto Rican coffee was once served to the Pope. But over the following century, tariffs, economic shifts toward sugar, and a shrinking rural workforce slowly hollowed the industry out. Then, in September 2017, Hurricane Maria hit the island directly and, in a matter of hours, destroyed somewhere between 80 and 90% of all the coffee trees on Puerto Rico. An industry with 3 centuries of history nearly wiped out in a single storm. Coffee trees take years to recover from that kind of damage, not seasons. Farmers who lost 20,000 trees and everything they'd invested had to start over from bare ground, waiting 3 to 5 years before a newly planted tree could produce again. Recovery efforts, backed by nonprofits, coffee companies, and private donors, have slowly pushed Puerto Rican coffee production back toward pre-hurricane levels nearly a decade later. But the lesson sits uncomfortably close to California's own story. An entire American coffee origin, 300 years in the making, can be gutted in a single afternoon. California's coffee industry is barely 2 decades old and concentrated on a stretch of coastline that depends entirely on a specific, narrow band of marine fog to survive. It hasn't been tested by a disaster yet. An industry this young is also this fragile in a different way, one that has nothing to do with weather at all. In early 2026, founding family behind California's pioneering coffee farm died unexpectedly. A shock that rippled through the small, tightly connected network of growers who had built this industry together over 2 decades of trial and error. For a network this new, built as much around the personal knowledge and relationships of a handful of people as around the trees themselves, a loss like that could have ended the entire experiment overnight. There was no large corporation, no institutional backstop, just a cooperative of independent farms that had grown up around one grower's original vision. Instead, the surrounding team and grower network moved quickly to keep the farms running and the harvest moving, stepping into leadership roles to hold the whole structure together. It was a reminder of just how young and just how dependent on a handful of committed people this entire industry still is. Most American commodity crops run on a simple relationship. A farmer grows it, sells it at market price, and a separate company handles processing and branding, keeping most of the markup for itself. California's coffee network was built around a different model, closer to a cooperative than a traditional supply chain. Individual farmers, many of them the same avocado growers who first agreed to interplant a strange new crop under their trees, don't just sell raw cherries and walk away. The central company that coordinates the network processes the harvest, builds the brand, negotiates with buyers, and then returns a majority share of the final sale price, sometimes described as around 60%, back to the farmer who grew it. That's a dramatically different split than most commodity farmers ever see, where the grower typically captures only a small fraction of what a bag eventually sells for on a shelf. It's part of why farmers who were initially skeptical, growers with decades of avocado and citrus experience and no reason to trust an unproven crop, agreed to give up a portion of their orchard to it in the first place. The economics only work because the coffee itself sells at luxury prices. Take away the $18 an ounce lots, and the auction wins, and the entire cooperative model collapses back into an ordinary, unprofitable specialty crop. In January 2026, a California-grown lot entered the Dubai coffee auction, one of the most prestigious stages in the entire coffee world, standing next to entries from Panama, Ethiopia, and Brazil, countries that have exported world-class coffee for generations. For the first time in its history, the mainland United States wasn't just a country that drinks coffee. It was competing as an origin, judged cup for cup against the places coffee was always supposed to come from. It took more than 2 decades to go from an experimental planting beside an avocado orchard to a seat at that table, and the entire industry behind it is still barely 100 acres, smaller than a single mid-sized farm in Brazil. It will likely never scale into anything close to a commodity crop. The economics, the hand harvesting, the months-long processing, none of it works at the volume a grocery store bag of coffee requires. But scale was never really the goal. Coffee wasn't supposed to grow here at all. The ocean fog, the avocado shade, the slow hand harvest, none of it was in any agricultural textbook when this started with a curious question about ornamental plants in a garden. It was built one tree, one fermentation tank, one stubborn grower at a time, on a stretch of coastline that has no business growing a tropical crop and somehow does anyway. So, the next time someone tells you coffee only comes from the tropics, remember there's a hillside 2 hours from Los Angeles quietly proving that rule wrong, one red cherry at a time, not with size, not with speed, but with fog, patience, and a stubborn refusal to accept that a map was ever the final word on what a plant could do.